So please all take your seats. S'il vous plaît, prenez vos places.
Please take your seats.
Monsieur le Président.
President of the Republic, Madam President of Lithuania, President of Colombia, ministers, ambassadors, and ladies and gentlemen, friends. As the writer Paul Valéry said, we find ourselves involved in very interesting times. All of the ideas that we held as true, everything that guaranteed the stability of international relations, everything which gave to nations and individuals confidence in the future, seems to be called into question. These words, written almost 100 years ago, are striking today by their relevance. We, in turn, are, there is no doubt about it, living in interesting times. And we're also living in a highly interconnected, globalized world characterized by many uncertainties and challenges. Multilateral cooperation has already given rise to unprecedented achievements, agreements on sustainable development, on tax, on climate change. And yet, those goals of a stable world economy and multilateral cooperation are seeming to slip from our grasp at the moment. There are people who are deprived of opportunity, who have no access to qualifications, who are being left behind, and who have a profound sentiment of injustice. Over these few days, we have occasion to work to reshape the foundations of multilateralism in order to ensure that it is more responsible, more effective, more inclusive, and that it generates results that everybody can benefit from.
Multilateralism must deliver an open and level playing field, well-governed markets, which will put healthy competition, integrity, and responsible business conduct at their heart. The OECD is leading this effort with multilateral tools like the Anti-Bribery Convention, the due diligence guidance on responsible business conduct, and the OECD G20 principles on corporate governance. We need to be particularly vigilant in emerging and often uncharted sectors, like digital technologies. We must also do more to tackle market-distorting practices and subsidies. Overcapacity is an area where multilateral cooperation is the only way forward, as demonstrated by the OECD Global Forum on Steel Excess Capacity. Now we need to make progress in other sectors, perhaps like aluminum, high technology, cement, flat glass, chemicals. Tax is another inherently international example. We need to keep the impressive momentum of the OECD's base erosion and profit shifting project, BEPS, and the global standard on automatic exchange of information. We have to look in depth at the challenges of taxing the rapidly changing digital economy. And we also need to tackle the quote-unquote dark side of global flows, whether they are bribery, corruption, cyber insecurity, counterfeiting, piracy, even human trafficking. However, leveling the playing field through well-governed markets and the promotion of integrity is only half the battle. We also have to strengthen our efforts to do all this in the context of inclusive growth. And this requires more effective social safety nets, better education, better provisions of skills, quality, affordable healthcare. It requires housing. New approaches found in the OECD PISA Global Competence Framework and also in the job strategy, they are equipping citizens for today, but mostly for tomorrow. The OECD's new framework for policy action on inclusive growth provides 24 indicators to help empower the people in the places that have been left behind. And finally, we must green multilateralism. OECD's work called Investing in Climate, Investing in Growth is a report that showed that climate-compatible policy packages can be engines of inclusive, sustainable growth at a time when we are still not on course to reduce warming to well below 2 degrees. We also need to wake up to new environmental emergencies. It is quite shocking, Monsieur le Président,
President, ladies and gentlemen.
By the middle of the century, the ocean could have more plastic than fish, measured by weight. La pluridisciplinarité,
multidisciplinarity of the OECD will underline the progress achieved. And this is one of the reasons why our OECD family is continuing to grow. It is gaining relevance and inclusivity by doing so. This year we have Lithuania and Colombia joining the organization, and their presidents are with us here today.
Mesdames, Messieurs,
ladies and gentlemen, in this multilateral endeavor, we are honored to welcome this great reformer and leader, the President of the French Republic, Emmanuel Macron. He has become the figurehead of powerful and responsible multilateralism. In the speech that he made last month before the Congress of the United States, he began a conversation that we are continuing today and tomorrow. And to quote him,
is to strengthen our cooperation. We can build the 21st century world order based on a more effective, accountable, results-oriented multilateralism. Our duty, our destiny is to work together and to build this new, strong multilateralism. Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President, you can count on the OECD to provide you with ongoing and constant effort at all moments. Thank you.
Mesdames, Messieurs,
ladies and gentlemen, it is my great honor and pleasure now to introduce the President of the French Republic, Mr. Emmanuel Macron.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary General, dear Angel. Excellencies, heads of states and government, Mr. Director General of the WTO, honourable ministers, honourable ambassadors, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very pleased to be here today and to open the meeting of the OECD Council. You have just recalled that I attach great attention to your organisation because your organisation is the child of post-war multilateralism, of the reconstruction of Europe and the transatlantic partnership. A creation of the men and women who understood that the conflicts of the past would no longer be repeated if dialogue and shared reflection replaced ultimatums and sometimes the clatter of arms. But the OECD represents something more. The organisation has changed and evolved, and you know that this organisation now represents 35 countries amongst the most advanced in the world. And so it is first and foremost a very heavy responsibility for the future that weighs on every one of us, because it is incumbent on the advanced nations more than on anybody else to propose the necessary changes so that the risks and threats recede. The OECD has appropriately placed itself at the centre of key struggles, in particular the fight against inequality, and it is these struggles that I have come to salute and support. But we need to do more together. We must put multilateralism back on track, a strong multilateralism. This is what I said at the United Nations, at Davos, at Beijing and Washington, and in St. Petersburg just a few days ago. And this is what we share with our European partners. Maybe we are somewhat unfortunate, and this goes with our generation, I think. We are not going to live through plain sailing. We can already see signs of storm, and those who believe that we can continue to organise meetings the way we've always done, because that is what we had become used to doing, are making a mistake. We have already started shouldering a heavy responsibility to avoid the worst, and I'd like to repeat it here in this forum that is a shining star within this concrete multilateralism and that is involved in reshaping multilateralism. Multilateralism is not a sum of bilateralisms. It's a dialogue with many voices, a chorus for action, a thought that we must always reinvent, weave together, reshape and make fairer and more effective in our world. But as we speak, the idea of abandoning or weakening what we have built together, or believing that we can continue business as usual, is not to see things as they are and refuse to look towards the future. In order to reinvent the future, we have to wage the wars of today. We have to understand the world we live in. And I would like here to dwell on 3 lessons that I think are essential as we speak and when we talk about our modern world. First of all, we need to understand the shock of globalization. We cannot refuse globalization. This is unrealistic, nor can we blame it for everything. Globalization has given us sometimes the best, but it has also unsettled our societies. Between 1990 and 2015, according to the World Bank, in one single generation, the number of people living in extreme poverty has decreased from 2 billion to 700 million. That's from 1/3 of the world's population to under 10% today. And this is thanks to trade and thanks to open markets. So let us not forget these actual facts before we start looking for dodgy solutions in withdrawal and isolation. Globalization has also enabled us to solve many of our problems by opening our societies and working together in cooperation. And the OECD has played its role with the IMF and many other organizations. But over the past decades, globalization has also changed our societies with changes to international trade, with deindustrialization in some countries, whilst other countries were emerging, and a major overhaul in many of our industrial sectors. And this is why globalization sometimes generates anxiety, in particular amongst the middle classes. Here, I would like to recall the benefits of globalization. But thinking that globalization with no regulation is fine and that an invisible hand will solve everything is a mistake. And we have seen this. We must also look at the darker side of globalization that has deeply unsettled many of our countries. The second lesson that I wanted to share with you is the lesson of inequality that have continued and even increased amongst regions and within our very societies. Can we really live sustainably in a world where the per capita wealth is 50 times higher in the OECD countries to what it is in the low-income countries? How not to see in rampant globalization and unbridled technological progress the causes of growing inequality in a same region between those who are connected and those who are exposed to these global developments. We have seen many divides, in particular over the past 20 years, because globalization has become financialized and also digitalized, and this has led to growing concentration of wealth in some regions of the world. And within countries, a concentration of wealth within some big cities and a concentration of wealth amongst the superstars, those who are able to innovate, those who are nomads of this world but have been able to succeed at the expense of those who very often are sedentary. And this has undermined our great adventure and our great promise to the middle classes to improve their lot and the lot of their children. And so these new inequalities, these multifaceted inequalities that we see, have undermined globalization, has undermined the trust of citizens vis-à-vis globalization. And of course, these are inequalities of income and of development, but also the root causes thereof, the inequalities in education, in health, in the exposure to climate change. Inequality also between men and women, a moral outrage as well as an economic nonsense. These inequalities in the condition and opportunities of populations are a moral outrage, and we can no longer abide by this situation. The third lesson is that globalization is becoming more violent, with less cooperation. The world order has been undermined. The emerging powers are more and more authoritarian. Terrorism is widespread and has led to deep fractures and divides in all the regions of the world. In our countries, in our societies, this violence has increased, and I would like to express a word of solidarity for our friends in Belgium who have been the victims yesterday of an attack in Liège. We have experienced these situations. We will never get used to this situation, and we will always be alongside those who are hit, and we would like to express the friendship and solidarity of France to our Belgian friends. This violence is everywhere, and this is also why some people have doubts. So in the face of this globalization that generates wealth whilst also creating inequality, the ultimate risk, the mistake that we could make, is to turn our backs to multilateralism, to deem that multilateralism is inefficient, inadapted, too bureaucratic. And I can hear that criticism that's often voiced and that is true to a certain extent. Have we made no mistakes? Have we got it all right? No. Haven't we tolerated inequalities that have appeared? Have we not be too slow in fighting against situations that you have described, Secretary General? Look at climate change. We were too slow in getting organized. We were too slow in fighting terrorism. The first meeting with all the stakeholders to fight the funding of terrorism was held just a few weeks ago here at the OECD. So, yes, sometimes we were not efficient. And I can hear that criticism. But becoming isolated, is that really the right answer? And I have my own opinion. We have already heard that tune in the past when other organizations before us, the League of Nations and others, and after the First World War, these organizations, the League of Nations and others, were not able to deal with the crisis in the 30s in a context of humiliation in Europe and deep economic recessions. Well, some heard these tunes. Some said, this world is collapsing. These people who are talking, who are trying to cooperate and establish rules are wrong. There are answers. They're hegemonic. There are truths, and they're non-cooperative. There is a solution, and that is to find a national solution in isolation. Our continent has experienced all of this. We have paid a heavy price, and we have suffered the consequences. The 30s show us a mirror. Let us look at that mirror. We do not want to be the sleepwalkers of today. At the time, we chose isolation. We decided to wage trade wars that rapidly escalated into fully fledged wars, and nobody, save a few visionaries, considered the need to protect, to foster the inception of a multilateral system that was established after the slaughter of the First World War. And we will remember the 100th anniversary of the First World War this year. We remember this. We remember it in our country. It would be folly to follow the same path. You cannot answer violence by increasing tension and violence. You cannot answer the shortfalls by locking ourselves into isolation and protectionism, rejecting multilateral solutions. And this is true today as it was yesterday, and we know it because all of these solutions only make the crisis worse instead of improving the situation. And this is why we have to fight three pitfalls in this splintering world. The comfort of isolated prosperity, ignoring the fact that economic success can never be built at the expense of other countries. Of course we can be rich at a given time because we're better than others, or because the world is so shaped. And those who believe that we can live in prosperity and in isolation will have a responsibility to shoulder. The second pitfall is the pitfall of protectionism that locks us in and that pitches countries against countries. Everybody stands to lose. And the third pitfall is strong government that uses authority to compensate for the shortcomings of international cooperation. When international cooperation is weak, it is our duty to shore it up. But having authoritarianism as a solution, that is forgetting our history and its lessons. And in order to avoid these dark episodes, we have to build a better multilateralism, a strong multilateralism. And I'd like here to explore some avenues for reflection to build this strong multilateralism. So in order to build a multilateralism that's not just words, but that provide real solutions to the challenges I have identified, we should neither give up the current system nor believe that it is perfect. No, we need to transform it, perfect it. In other fora, I have spoken about geopolitical issues, how to achieve peace and reduce tensions. Here, I would like to refer to other matters, and I'll start with one of the pillars of strong multilateralism, and that is trade. It seems that many here in this room take a keen interest regarding trade. And here we have a foundation. It's a foundation that we built. It's not something that anybody imposed from outside. This isn't something that other people invented. The World Trade Organization is our invention. We dreamt it up. We established its rules. We agreed to those rules as sovereign nations. This foundation has to be preserved. And the woes of globalization would be far worse if we had to rely on the law of the fittest. The World Trade Organization makes it possible to establish cooperation, to fight unfair competition, to avoid trade wars. But obviously, we need to work all together in order to reshape the World Trade Organization in depth. Today, we are confronted to a crisis that exists in many of our economies because of unfair competition or because of dumping. But should we destroy the world order that we established? Certainly not. Regarding excess capacity in steel, I count on the work of the OECD and its commitment to encourage all the members of the Global Forum to finally comply with their commitments. We have committed ourselves vis-à-vis the G20 and the OECD also. Of course, we're not going to solve this through bilateral trade wars. This is an issue we can only solve through the cooperation of the international community. It's through cooperation and exchange of information that we can solve this issue. We will have to extend it also to other sectors in order to make sure that we put an end to unfair practices, for example, regarding intellectual property, or in sectors such as aluminium, electronics, or batteries. And international trade must be improved when there are unfair practices or when intellectual property is plundered. It's quite normal that we react, but we have to do it together in the right way. Because who can explain to their workers or business partners that we're not able to enforce this world order? But breaking rules and waging trade wars bilaterally is not the solution. I would like to repeat, as we're about to take important decisions, unilateral solutions and threats of a trade war will not set straight the serious imbalances in world trade. These solutions might bring a symbolic satisfaction in the short term, but the people who gave me my position understand these things. They are not fools. You can, of course, claim a victory and say, I'm going to change the rules, but you're not going to fool the people. Those who wage trade wars saw an increase in unemployment and an increase in prices as a result. Why? Because trade is no longer bilateral. Look at the phone you have in your pocket. If I read what's written on the label, and you might all have the same model with a few exceptions, it says designed in California, assembled in China. Maybe some of the pieces even were made in Europe. Who knows? And that's true for any product, for any sector. It's globally made. And so if we decide to put an end to this order, to fracture it, who will pay the price? Our populations and our workers. Because there'll be less competition, because in some sectors we'll have growing unemployment, and because prices will rise. So these are no solutions. They're not a real solution at any rate. And we know this through experience. We know what that leads to. A trade war is a war that everybody loses. Our industry, our farmers, our consumers, and our citizens. Throughout history, we often thought that we could find solutions to crisis through isolation. In Europe, we also thought that we could answer pressure through weakness. And I'd like to say this very clearly. This will get us nowhere. On this subject, more than any other today, our challenge is to find collective answers. The person who is strong is the person who has the law on his side, that complies with the rules, that sticks to the commitments, unless you're not strong but violent. Unless we all want to go to a state of nature with no cooperation. And so when you use law, when you use the rules that we have set ourselves, then we must continue to follow the law, to follow the rules, because this is what we owe our citizens, and this is what Europe will do. A reshaped WTO can help us, and I have just mentioned some of the reforms. So specifically, we have to help the WTO to shape new rules. The negotiations have been blocked for many years. The latest progress almost goes back to the establishment of the WTO itself in 1994. These last decades, we have made very little progress, and this does not enable us to rise up to the challenges that I mentioned. We also need to make sure that the WTO can help apply the rules. For example, the dispute resolution body is essential. It enables us to enforce rules and to resolve disputes between countries in a fair way. But we need to improve its functioning, and in particular the appellate body. Of course, I hear criticism, but I don't think we should block the system. This is a threat and undermines the system. And I would like to say to all those who for years thought that it was a good idea to go into the WTO and then block everything at the WTO. That's not a good idea. If we want things to go forward, we need to bring about practical reforms that will enable multilateralism in trade to function and to bring about the real solutions to the challenges we face. Therefore, I propose a negotiation which at the beginning, in its initial stage, would bring together the United States, the European Union, China and Japan. It would then be extended very quickly to the G20 countries and the OECD, and this would help us reshape the WTO. It's time for us to find specific solutions. Together, we should carry out a diagnosis to understand the shortcomings of the current system. And at the G20 this year in Buenos Aires, we should have a first roadmap. Here we have to overhaul the rules that govern international competition. International competition has evolved far too much over the past 25 years for the current rules to apply. The new rules have to help us meet the current challenges of trade. Massive public subsidies that distort global markets, intellectual property, social rights, and protection vis-à-vis climate change. Yes, protection vis-à-vis climate change, because we have to be consistent. And when we talk about trade and reshaping the WTO, we have to place the environment squarely at the center of the WTO and our trade policies. We have to use trade policies as a lever to make headway and fulfill our environmental objectives. Otherwise, we will not be able to cooperate. We will make commitments for ourselves, for our countries, for our industries, and then we'll have to negotiate with partners who are not ready to make the same efforts. And I say this regardless of the commitments of France at international level, because a lot of people have signed and ratified the Paris Agreement. And so this is why we should adopt standards to produce in a way as to respect the environment and guarantee sustainable development. And I think the European Union should set the example by complying with the Paris Agreement in all of its trade agreements and through sanctions for any breach of environmental norms. This is the only way to be consistent. It's the only way to together speed up and do what we ought to do for ourselves and for our children. And we're not talking about something that's a luxury. We are already experiencing the deep consequences of global warming in many regions of the world, and we are sometimes going too slowly. The reshaping of the WTO is our horizon. The path ahead will not be easy, and this is why forums such as the OECD must help us to shape these new rules.
Deuxième sujet sur lequel je voulais...
And the second subject upon which I wanted to talk about in a little more detail, when we're talking about strong multilateral strong multilateral systems in social, economic and development terms is tax. Talking about current inequalities and fragmentation of the world that we live in is also to look at the consequences of globalization, the emergence of new economic players that do much good to the economy by creating jobs, notably, but that have sometimes based their work on non-cooperative strategies and that have carried out their work away from the moral gaze. And in this context, I want to underline the work that the OECD has carried out, a remarkable work in this particular field. And I say this notably because we've reached tolerable limits in this field. World revolutions today depend on specific means, notably tax instruments, to be able to face the changes of a new world. Nobody can do away with their tax duty. What's going on is that all these upheavals that I was talking about create wonderful new opportunities, but also lead to the destruction of jobs in a great number of sectors. How can you accept that large corporations, notably in the digital sphere, that are at the forefront of these transformations, that are shaking out the way that we used to work and lead to the loss of employment for hundreds of thousands of people who'll have to reskill to find jobs elsewhere? How can you explain that these digital companies contribute nothing to the common good, contribute nothing to the skilling or reskilling of our citizens, and contribute nothing to the safety nets that will help them chart their road in a difficult world? And how can you explain that to citizens who are taxpayers, who continue to pay their taxes in a world where there are others who simply avoid taxes altogether? This isn't a serious approach. In this context, the first initial work carried out by the OECD has made incredible headway because it was relayed elsewhere by the G20, by the European Union, and it led to strong multilateral momentum. And in that light, the BEPS project at the OECD was a huge step forward. The inclusive framework of the BEPS project, which brings together more than 100 states and territory, has been crowned with undeniable success. It brought into the sphere of world tax governance emerging countries from all regions of the world. And it's now essential that the majority of those states that contributed to building the BEPS edifice respect the principles that they enshrined, without which that project will be undermined and fritter away. Now, I defend the idea of an open world, but this world is only acceptable if competition is fair and subject to regulation, if it can be explained to our citizens. You talked about the speech I made to the American Congress, and there I referred to accountability. We can only move forward if we are fully accountable, and I cannot give a fair account to our citizens of the current tax architecture because it's fundamentally flawed. So beyond what's been done by the OECD in BEPS, we need to do more. We need to restore tax justice, and that means tackling all non-taxation circumstances. Non-taxation is an open pathway towards tax fraud and avoidance, and we're currently standing at a historical crossroads. We will not be forgiven for impeding the collective momentum that has been garnered by the BEPS project. I said this last week in Paris. I said this to the players in the sector. A fair tax framework is a framework that factors in the upheaval of the digital domain. All the high-tech giants, whether they're American, Chinese, or European, were all there for the summit on high-tech industries. And I gave them the same speech because the system that we live in is not a sustainable system. For a very long time, up until just a few months ago, people thought we could continue to work along the lines that were set out previously. And there's a scandal that's really hitting hard at that established order, be it in terms of Cambridge Analytica, in terms of Facebook. And so now there is a strong response that has been brought to bear that will be applied by the majority of players, notably what's been done in the data protection field in the EU. You can keep your blinders on, but at some point these problems will raise their heads on the horizon. What has been deemed acceptable up to now will no longer be deemed acceptable. We have to prepare a response for that. We have to lay the groundwork for a new approach. And in that context, there's a short-term proposal that has been made which is supported by France, working on a directive in the EU on a mid-term basis. It's a pragmatic approach and it's a strong, robust response, and I'm favourable to that. But it's essential that the OECD carry on in the best possible way its work so that BEPS can be moved forward, so that there can be an international solution provided for a fairer framework. I wanted to speak very strongly in this regard. I am convinced that we need a fast and speedy response to this. And in terms of this, it's essential to maintain the work that's carried out here at the OECD, because these are works founded on civic trust, and it's essential that we ensure that we can speak to our citizens and ensure that they understand the efforts that we undertake. Europe has to lead the way in that context. It has to come up with the right regulation, efficient regulation, as I mentioned. And I also in terms of strong multilateralism, wanted to focus on the fight against money laundering and corruption. And in this light, I want to pay tribute to the exceptional work undertaken by the OECD, because money laundering and corruption are veritable scourges which mine the trust that citizens have in our social and economic systems. They also block the opening up of new economic sectors, fritter away national riches, and essentially cause an erosion of trust. There are a whole series of other projects that we have to undertake, that we have to speedily ensure that are made reality, to ensure that this multilateralism is redressed. And I'm just going to finish up on quoting two: that of development and that of the environment. In terms of the environment, I was talking about this in relation to trade. The environment, a healthy environment, is not a luxury, it is our duty, because in the context of the current multilateral state of play, we have to respond to the environmental challenge that we face, without which the situation will only be aggravated, and that this will lead nation states to instate uncooperative responses, and will be set into a quagmire that we'll only step out of through the instatement of crises. And we see this in terms of coastal erosion in some countries. There are other areas where there are major droughts, which leads to heavy outflow of people into other countries. There are a number of countries in the world that already live through unbearable levels of air pollution, and people will begin to respond to that. So we have taken a number of commitments agreed on a multilateral basis, the Paris Agreement, that we're not collectively complying with. We're at the moment on a pathway 1.5 to 2 degrees above the commitments that we had made, and which were already made to avoid the most serious consequences of climate change on our planet. So we must go beyond what we've been doing on our national, regional, and international strategies. It's essential that we do that, and in terms of a strong and robust multilateral framework that we need. And in that context, France has carried the message of the environment to the United Nations with a number of other countries. And then there's the last major challenge that we face, the challenge of development. And here I'd like to appeal to commitment. Commitment in terms of increasing development aid. France will take its share of that burden and will increase its public development aid to 0.55% of gross national income by 2022. And I sincerely appeal to all of us to walk down the path of greater international solidarity. I know how committed the OECD is to this end, and I'd like in this light to pay tribute to the OECD's involvement for the instatement of the Sustainable Development Goals through the accompaniment and assistance it brings in the work of its committees to those state parties that need it. Our commitment for sustainable development be carried out, because this is how we'll reduce inequality gaps. This is how we will present these crises in the offing. We cannot just have a security-based approach to these challenges. Security is part and parcel of the solution that we'll bring to bear. But if we want to preserve our world, we need to instate a policy based on cooperation and development. And over the last 20 years, we've let this fall by the wayside. We haven't really factored this subject in at the heart of our debates. Now, I know we're very unlucky. We're going to have to battle on all fronts at the same time. But we do not have a choice in this regard, because failing to do so will engender even worse consequences than what we see today and what we allow for today. And so in that context, we need to focus on education and health. We must ensure that everybody has equal access to quality education. It's completely unacceptable today that 250 million young people are still don't have quality education. And that's why at Dakar in the beginning of this year, I committed to contributing 200 million euros to the Global Partnership for World Education, and I still call on the other donors to garner and mobilize around this issue, because it really is of the essence. There are still pockets around the world where children do not have access to fair schooling, especially girls, and this is a prerequisite in fighting against radicalism, the erosion of poverty, peace, and in these regions. We have to also take into account health and health issues, notably issues surrounding the health and maternal health. We cannot tolerate that 300,000 young women die each year during pregnancy. We cannot tolerate that 200 million of them still have no access to contraception in areas specifically where there's very little access to education and a lack of schools. So development is at the heart. It is the central battle that we can wage against inequalities. But it'll only work if we win the battle of multilateralism and if future generations still have the luxury of asking and raising these questions. Securing multilateralism will be a way for these generations to look to the future. We have to focus on development. This battle is our battle as political leaders, but it's a battle that should be waged by all. We all must bear our share of responsibility in this regard, and this starts at the society level. It involves all political leaders. It involves all those players in the contemporary field of capitalism that have to be more social and humane in their work. They have to take on some part of their collective duty. This is the philosophy that underlines the economic rationale that we will relay at the G20 and other international platforms. And this is what France will do when it takes over the presidency of the G7 next year. Secretary General, the OECD has, over time and under your impetus, realigned to the changing world and society that we live in. It has successfully waged battle and lifted and responded to the challenges that I mentioned, notably in the tax area or in the area of fighting against excess industrial capacity. It must, in this regard, be legitimate. And in that regard, France supports the potential for its enlargement in terms of a geographical balance. And this is why I would like to contribute to welcoming Colombia and Lithuania here in to the OECD. I would like to pay tribute to the work carried out by your two countries, people in your two countries, to be able to do so. The OECD was born in the wake of the Second World War to help rebuild Europe. It has changed and transformed, and I hope that it today will carry forward this avant-garde message for a strong multilateralism that I believe in an education, social, economical development prism, and I'm delighted and proud to host in our capital, in Paris, an exemplary organization that is capable of adapting to new challenges to create good regulations. The OECD is no longer merely European or transatlantic. In these troubled times, I say this humbly but with unmasked ambition, France and Europe stand at the forefront of this battle because working in cooperation, drawing on the rule of law, this is the very precious treasure that we have been able to build and build up since the end of the Second World War. We today have a European duty because we must respond to the international challenge to ensure that this strong multilateralism see the light of day. I know that Paris can and must be a hub for this efficient multilateralism by strengthening the ties that exist between the OECD, UNESCO, the OIF, the Organisation Internationale de la Francophonie. All of these organizations are firmly bent on ensuring emancipation, culture, education, redistribution and development. And that's why I wanted the commemoration of the end of the Second World War, which brought together, which was waged by 80 countries, to give rise to a forum for peace, like an incubator for civil society projects, to be able to reinvent in a multilateral way the service to the public good. It's not an issue that's merely technical in nature. Multilateralism isn't merely a shimmering technocracy. It's a daily test of efficiency. Robert Schuman said, Europe was not achieved and we waged war. I want to say, and I want to be able to say alongside you in the years to come, we have managed to reshape Europe. We have breathed new lease of life into multilateralism, and we did not undergo war. And if I may quote Paul Valéry, who explained that we knew at one time that civilizations could disappear, and this is what's at play today. We are comfortably seated in these conference rooms. We cannot, for all that, forget the contemporary challenges that exist. We cannot forget about climate change because it threatens others. We cannot ignore inequalities because it's not our problem. We cannot ignore the fact that divisions or divisions of opinion and divergences can lead to war. In that context, we need to ensure that we defend vigorously and strongly the multilateral system. OECD will help us to do that. We need to strengthen this strong basis for multilateralism, which I fundamentally believe in, because it is the only way to reconcile sovereign issues and cooperation. It's the only system wherein you can ensure that you have legitimacy in an open world in terms of the responsibilities that we bear vis-à-vis our citizens. And so this is what we will calmly but determinedly attempt to do. Thank you.
Mr. President, that was a real tour de force. It was a wonderful description of your vision, our mission, and our collective ambition. I have to say that, of course, we now have our work cut out for us. We have our homework to do, and thank you for reminding us, and thank you for showing the way. So, President Grybauskaitė, President Santos, dear friends, Prime Ministers, Deputy Prime Ministers, Ministers, it's a great honor for me to once again welcome you as we celebrate the accession of Lithuania and Colombia to the organization. This is the power of multilateralism in action. As we gain in diversity, as we gain in strength, in search of solutions for common global challenges that work for all. It's a time for celebration. With the accession of Colombia and Lithuania, the OECD becomes a more vibrant, a more pluralistic and inclusive forum for the exchange and the sharing of best practices. We will thus be able to further expand the reach and the impact of our evidence-based policy solutions, our instruments, and our standards. Through the increasingly rigorous accession process, Colombia and Lithuania's policies have been closely examined by more than 20 OECD committees in fields as diverse as public governance, anti-corruption, environment, statistics, education, fiscal affairs. It has been a real 360-degree exercise. In-depth review of both countries' legislation, the policies, but also the practices. What is happening in the ground, in the field. OECD peers will continue to monitor Colombia and Lithuania's progress and performance. There will be post-accession reviews. There will be continuous monitoring and feedback in order to support the two countries in their reform program and their reform process. The accession has been a catalyst for impressive reforms. And let me mention the case of Lithuania first. As a result of the accession process, Lithuania adopted major legislative reforms linked to the OECD Anti-Bribery Convention, the codes of liberalization, the protection of whistleblowers, the governance of state-owned enterprises, the design of its private pension system. And these are just a few, perhaps some of the most important reforms. Lithuania joins us on the eve of the anniversary of its centennial, of its statehood, rounding out aspirations for OECD membership across the Baltic states. Now we have Estonia, and now we have Latvia, Mr. Prime Minister, and of course, we celebrate the arrival of Lithuania. And let me just say to you all that the first time the three Baltic states declared jointly that they wanted to join the OECD was in 1996. So it took 22 years. You know, we should do a little better than that. But we'd like to applaud the dedication and the commitment of President Grybauskaitė in particular. She represents the face of this effort. She represents the leadership for this effort. This leadership has enabled your country to complete the accession process in 3 short years. We were discussing with Mr. Bonucci whether Lithuania's accession process was the fastest. And we don't know whether it was faster than Israel or faster than Chile, but faster than Latvia. It was certainly among the fastest. So congratulations for that. And let me also say, President Grybauskaitė, that not only have you been the energy behind this drive, but also you have come here several times to accelerate the process and to tell members the Lithuanian story, if you will. So let me ask you to please join me on stage for the signing of the agreement on the terms of accession of the Republic of Lithuania.
Presidents, Ministers, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, we will now proceed to the signature of the agreement on the accession of Lithuania to the OECD Convention. The President of Lithuania and the Secretary General will sign 2 originals of the accession agreement and then stand to exchange the documents. Lithuania will become a member of the OECD on the date when it deposits its instrument of accession to the OECD Convention, and I would now like to invite President Grybauskaitė to make some remarks.
After such speeches, I can do only remarks, because everything was said. And it's better than somebody says good words about your country, somebody else than yourself. Because usually Lithuanians were very self-critical, and we're still all the time not satisfied how well we are doing. Why I want just to remind us all that for us this last 100 years was very painful and very fast growing and with a lot of achievements. In these 100 years we had gone through 2 wars, world wars, 50 years of Soviet occupation. But after this, we became members of European Union, NATO, and we became members of OECD. And this is symbolic because OECD was created to implement the Marshall Plan. After the Second World War, after the 2 world wars, to rebuild Europe from scratch. And today, still, this organization needed, because it is better policies for better lives. We need better policies and better lives, especially then we see fragmentation, isolationism, and anti-multilateralism becoming a fashion in the world. Why, for us, to become a members of family where they support each other, where good experiences still matters, where cooperation still is value, democracy and security and safety of our people is a value. For us, it is important. So I would like to thank you very much, everybody who have been so helpful in these 3 years of fast marathon running, because we have been prepared, but you need to go through some periods to try to persuade others that we are ready. And we try to do this, myself also, as you mentioned, but I want to thank you all member states, members of organization, all staff who supported us in this process. For us, the pressure, external pressure for the reforms was useful because this membership process is useful for us in the first place. But now we are ready to share our experiences, we are ready to learn from you, and we are ready to be the think tank of G20 together with you. Thank you all.
Thank you, President Grybauskaitė. Now, turning to the accession of Colombia, joining the OECD confirms the vision of President Santos about Colombia's rightful place among like-minded democracies. I have to say, Mr. President, that when you were elected, you started a worldwide tour before you took office. And we started getting these calls from the office of the Prime Minister of the UK, from the office of the President of Spain or, you know, of the Prime Minister, of the Chancellor of Germany. And all we're saying, we have the President-elect of Colombia here, and he says he wants to join the OECD. What do we do? No? They say, well, tell him yes, of course. You know, tell him you absolutely support the process. You know, so, but well, that was almost 2 mandates ago, huh? Because we started the process really 5 years ago. But in the meantime, of course, we were warming up the engines. But I have to say, you were always in front. But you then said, I have 2 objectives. I want to achieve the peace in my country. This is first and foremost. This is my first objective. And then I would like to complete the process of joining the OECD. And then, of course, you know, you were talking about internal strife, about half a century of internal strife. You were talking about tens of thousands of dead. You were talking about hundreds of thousands of wounded, and you were talking about millions of displaced people. And of course, you did it. And you very, I think, deservedly got the Nobel Prize for it. And we'd like to again express our deepest admiration and our deepest congratulations for that achievement. But of course, you also said you wanted to join the OECD. And there we could probably help you a little bit more than with the peace, was of course, of the Colombians' own doing. And I have to say, throughout the accession process, Colombia made impressive strides. It reformed the justice system. It reduced informality in the labor market. It was also instrumental in implementing national policies on water, on chemicals management, on the governance of state-owned enterprises, on including the removal, by the way, of ministers from the boards of state-owned enterprises, which was a real revolution, and I have to say a very, very good example in terms of best practices. To comply with the OECD Anti-Bribery Convention, you actually modified your corporate liability regime, and then it just goes on and on and on. So, Mr. President, you and I, this is something not very well known, when you were ambassador to the International Coffee Organization in your very early youth, and of course the Mexican ambassador to the International Coffee Organization was a certain Monsieur Gurria. And when we met, and then over the years where we've been seeing each other and talking to each other and sometimes conspiring with each other, yeah, that was President Macron is trying to find out. This was a little bit before you were born, probably, no? Just about, or you're almost there. So it's just it's quite some time ago, but we looked so good, you know. So I'd like to join President Santos to ask President Santos to join me on stage, Mr. President, to sign the agreement on the terms of accession of the Republic of Colombia to the OECD Convention.
We will now proceed to the signing of the agreement on the accession of Colombia to the OECD Convention. The President of Colombia and the Secretary General will sign 2 originals of the accession agreement and then stand to exchange the documents. Colombia will become a member of the OECD when it deposits its instrument of accession to the OECD Convention, and I would now like to invite President Santos to make some remarks on the accession of Colombia to the OECD.
President Macron, Madam President of Lithuania, Mr. Prime Minister of Lithuania, Mr. Secretary General, ministers, ambassadors. I was here, as Angel just said, 8 years ago, asking several member countries for support to the accession of Colombia. I made this decision absolutely convinced that good practices, high standards, and constant benchmarking, as well as peer learning, are the foundations of good government. And the search of good government has been one of my priorities in my public life. I received great support and a lot of encouragement from all your governments to undertake this endeavor. And I also received the enthusiasm and the guidance of my good friend Ángel Gurría and all of his staff. I made this a priority of my government. The ministers here today were part of my team, and practically every Colombian institution took part and played an active role during the review process of the 23 committees. We have just formalized the final and successful result of this effort. And I am glad that both Secretary Gurría, my good friend Ángel Gurría, and myself were able to stamp our names before President Macron, another good friend, in what is one of the most important legacies I leave for my country. The signature of the peace agreement that put an end to more than 50 years of internal conflict was another great moment and a necessary condition for our development to take off. Both achievements represent the foundations of a modern country that can now devote all its energy and all its talent in improving the lives of the Colombian people and in fighting for principles that we share, like multilateralism. In these past 8 years, Colombia has made great transformations. We are now, fortunately, a country in peace. Last Sunday, we celebrated the presidential elections that are unprecedented. To see the former guerrilla leader, alias Timoshenko, casting his vote for the first time as an ordinary citizen is a triumph for our democracy. They were the most peaceful and most transparent elections with the highest participation in our history. Our democracy is therefore stronger. For the first time, our middle class is the largest segment of our society, and it's growing very fast. More than 5.5 million people have come out of poverty, and we created more than 3.5 million jobs. Investment has reached historic levels and is one of the highest in Latin America. A revolution in infrastructure is underway. We are investing more than $40 billion in this endeavor. We also made great progress during these 8 years in other fronts. We put education at the top of our budget allocation. We made education free in all public schools and substantially increased access to higher education. We made access to our health system a fundamental right of every citizen and reached universal coverage. We are making technology available to all citizens. We connected all of our municipalities. We have more than 1,100 municipalities with broadband and internet coverage. And last but not least, we were able to lower our Gini coefficient, that is to say, our inequality, more than any other country in the region. But we have a long, long way still to go. In the accession process, we were also able, like Angel just mentioned, to strengthen our independence of our supervisory bodies, to modernize corporate governance and our state-owned enterprises, to improve regulatory policies, to extend the scope of supervision to financial conglomerates, to strengthen the capacity of the Ministry of Labor, to enforce labor regulations and fight informality, to fight with much more efficacy corruption, and I could go on. Some of these reforms were not easy to sell internally, but the political will and the fact-driven arguments that the OECD gave us were key for their implementation. So we can say that we have profited immensely from this accession process, and we also believe Colombia can humbly contribute with our own experiences to enrich the work of this great organization. Colombia is very proud to be the member number 37 of the OECD. International cooperation is today more necessary than ever before to solve the many challenges the world is confronting. I want to finish once again thanking all of you, the members, and the staff for your help and support from the bottom of my heart and in the name of 50 million Colombians. I speak on behalf of a nation that is committed to the values and the visions that inspired this organization. This accession is a great honor and also a great responsibility. Thank you very much.
J'ai maintenant l'honneur d'inviter sur scène Monsieur le Président
It's my honor to invite the President of the French Republic on scene.
to the stage to join President Santos and the Secretary General for a photograph. This brings to a close the signing ceremony, and we will now proceed to the family photograph of the Ministerial Council meeting, which will take place upstairs in the garden of the chateau. I would like to ask everybody, please remain seated while the presidents and the ministers exit the room, accompanied by our teams. Yes, please, everybody else, remain seated while the presidents and ministers exit the room.
le met devant ou... Je sais pas. La précision, bah non, c'est pas chez nous. Tu rappelles ça? Ah, au pied de la table, comme on avait fait. Ah bah attends, pousse-toi. Voilà, tu vas vas-y, merci. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Il y a 3 micros là, un par table. Ouais, ouais. C'est les derniers? Un par table. Ouais. Là, celui-là, c'est le 1. Ça, c'est le 3. Voilà. Une fois qu'ils sont même dans l'ordre. Bien d'en rechercher. Oui, il pose ces images de vacances. Ça, si on n'est pas seul au monde. Ouais, moi je retourne en régie. Ça marche. À tout, hein.
La mademoiselle. Oui. Quand c'est bon pour toi, c'est bon pour moi.
Here you go. Stephanie, voilà.
Tac, attention, troisième
It's
main.
live, I think. Is it live already? It usually is, yeah.
L'autre, c'est que ça fonctionne. Et si ça fonctionne pas, c'est de la faute de lui.
Should we write her so they can come in, or should we still wait?
No, you can tell Terry to come in, I think. I mean, we can give a few more minutes. I don't know.
And I tell her, let's have 10 minutes.
Let's get it started, because otherwise it's going to, people are going to be in.
It's fresh sitting down?
Yes. You can sit wherever you want. In fact, we could already start taking notes. Okay. You guys, you know more to like already take the stickers off. I see here.
We can do it aside, yeah.
I was going to say, yeah.
Yeah.
So it's kind of satisfying.
Yeah, let's get started. But yeah, hang around here. But you can always send us stuff on Messenger, on WhatsApp. If I will do on I just have to
What I did was just 15 minutes and 5 minutes. But that's the one. So in case the person misses.
I'm going to ask Stephanie and Terry if we have to do it, and then. Oh, sure. Hi, Terry. Stephanie again. You can come over now. We're finished here. Thank you. Okay, sure. Okay, yeah. Oh, okay. Because I was not sure whether I pressed the button. Yeah, sure. Thank you.
Who's the moderator? Huh? Who's the moderator?
Right after we talked, I was about a minute away from the interview, like super fast. I did a lot of these. Came out and
You were
just
stuck. 45 minutes later.
Yeah.
I was up. Andrea, c'est ton microphone.
D'accord, ok, merci beaucoup.
Et
Vous savez comment ça fonctionne? Vous ne touchez absolument à rien. La seule chose, c'est... Vous voyez, là, on ne m'entend pas.
Ouais.
Quasiment pas. Quand vous parlez comme ça, vous voyez, on ne m'entend pas. Attention.
Ah oui, très très puissant. D'accord.
Non, ce qu'il faut faire, c'est ça.
D'accord. Sur le coup. D'accord.
Oui.
T'as une idée où tu veux
Je voulais m'asseoir sur la gauche, en fait.
Comme vous le souhaitez.
Mais j'ai une robe bleue, mais c'est pas grave. La même couleur que le siège.
C'est pas grave. Donc si vous êtes là, il n'y a pas...
Comme ça.
Parfait. même pour être bien, même pour vous sentir bien. À partir du moment où vous touchez et que vous preniez, le micro va aussi.
D'accord.
Vous faites ça, en fait, vous allez faire ça. Et quand vous faites comme ça fait 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, et en fait, on vous entend plus. Alors que là, en fait, on vous entend tout le temps.
D'accord, ok.
Allez.
Merci beaucoup.
Terry needs to chat with you about this is your iPad. It's going to allow you to see all the questions that come in, right? Okay. While we're waiting, it's...
I will do it here.
So I was unable to send you guys the slides, the specific marine biodiversity slides. I apologize. You'll see them on the fly. This is that video that we did 2 years ago. Which is also terrestrial biodiversity. I thought it was a good idea to have something while we're transitioning away. Why don't I get this slide with some
transition, so yeah, keep talking or tell us you want the poll. Okay, I have a transition thing that's announcing the poll. Okay. So I give the question in English, then in French.
Okay, and it'll show up on the screen too. And so
Yeah,
they can
only
use...
in English.
Oh, yes, you're right.
Yeah, that's why. I will put it in French.
Okay, so you give it in French, that's good.
Yes, a little bit. And then for the results, well, now I propose you to discover the results of the poll.
Okay.
Does it give them enough time? In case there is no response yet, right answer.
Okay. Okay.
Answer, and then after him.
Okay. And normally it shows on the screen behind you as well. So this is for you to hold during the session.
Thank you.
The mic will go live automatically. There is a table, so what'll happen is you can sit here and start music. So they'll start watching the music, and then your name will appear on the screen, and when the music launches, you should all go up to the stage. Once it stops. So feel free to
What
have
should
a
I
seat, 'cause
do?
she's not
Yeah.
going to... I mean, that was from the previous session that they reserved.
Okay, thank you. Sean, my name is nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. So, Elise, what was the final question? The way you were going to ask it to me?
Okay, I'm not sure we'll have time, but once the plastic is collected, what are the next steps into recycling? Who's at the end of the chain? And what are the main locations for the implementation of the plastic bank? And do you recruit your program leaders and the people who collect? And how do you recruit, your program leaders and the people who collect the plastics? But I'm not sure we'll have.
Yeah, that's where I'm curious if it's easier if I just kind of include that in the answer to your first question as compared to the back and forth.
Okay. But you have the first question, right? The plastic bank is an inspiring example of how an innovative idea, bridging an environmental and a social need, can bring concrete change. How do you can scale up this project, and what other innovative ideas are out that are having the same impact? How can we scale it up?
If we could just cut through what other...
Sure. Okay. Can you take off your badge?
Yeah, lapels.
Just so you know, there's a timekeeper in the car for 15 minutes before the end. She'll start to warn you.
Hello, my name is Elise Depnou and I'm the moderator of this session. I'm a journalist for AFP and a consultant for the UNFCCC. These beautiful images you've just seen here were on biodiversity in general. The OECD has been working on terrestrial and marine biodiversity for years, and this film was realized in 2016. In this session, we will focus on marine biodiversity, but all these systems are interlinked. More than 80% of ocean pollution comes, in fact, from land-based pollution. Do any of you remember when, on World Oceans Day last year, Marcus Scheffer, a Brazilian surfer, narrowly avoided a collision with a fridge? A big white fridge. This is a guy who was used to spotting turtles and dolphins instead. Oceans are a resource we cannot repair. They are the very source of all life, ours included. Everybody